dam is an obstruction both to fish, macroinvertebrates, and just the free-flowing river capabilities. And so this is why the owner also wished to remove the dam as well.
For 180 years, a wall of concrete and timber held a Wisconsin river hostage, and the town that grew up beside it was terrified of the day someone finally tore it down. Not because they feared a flood, they feared the opposite. Everyone in Baraboo was convinced that the second the dam came out, the river would drain away into the mud and simply vanish, taking the fish and the water with it. So, on a frozen morning in 1997, when the first backhoe crawled onto the bank, nobody was cheering. They were bracing for their river to die. A river-tamed Baraboo, Wisconsin, 1843. A crew of settlers drove timber and poured concrete across a fast, rocky river to turn a mill wheel. They were not thinking about fish. They were thinking about lumber and flour and the money a moving river could make. The dam they raised that year would stand, in one form or another, for the next century and a half. The river they were beginning to tame had been running wild for thousands of years before they arrived. It begins near the village of Kendall and winds roughly 120 miles east, dropping more than 150 feet on its way to join the Wisconsin River at Portage. Nearly a third of that fall happens in a single 5-mile stretch of rock and white water near the city itself, a churning run of riffles and gravel that gave the river its character. The older river. Long before any mill, the Ho-Chunk knew this water intimately. Every autumn, their canoes came down the Baraboo in long lines, 20 or 30 at a time, running toward the marshes when the mink and muskrat furs were at their best. 1,000 years before that, people built burial mounds along these same banks, mounds that were still standing when the first settlers arrived in the 1830s. For century after century, the Baraboo was a road, a larder, and a home, not a resource waiting to be harnessed. Even the river's name comes from someone who came to trade. Locals call it the Boo, but the full name is thought to trace back to a French-Canadian fur trader named Francois Baraboo, who set up a post near its mouth more than 250 years ago. A staircase of ponds. Then the mills came, and the river changed character completely. In 1840, 8 years before Wisconsin was even a state, the territorial legislature passed the Mill Dam Act, a law that all but invited settlers to throw a dam across any waterway they liked. They took the invitation. Over the following decades, as many as 11 low dams went up along the Baraboo. They powered sawmills, grist mills, and paper mills, and later they generated electricity. They drew workers, raised towns, and turned a fast-moving stream into a staircase of still ponds. Baraboo itself grew into a thriving little engine of industry on the back of that falling water. The Island Woolen Mill rose on the East Bend in 1863, fed by a raceway cut to deliver the current straight to its wheels. The town became famous for more than its mills. It was the winter home of the Ringling Brothers Circus, and the old circus grounds still sit along the river that powered the town that hosted them. The water and the town had grown up together, tangled at the root, which is why what came later was so hard for people to accept. Dying by inches. A dam does something quiet and permanent to a river. It stops it. Behind each wall, the fast rocky channel slowed, spread, and went still, turning mile after mile of living rapids into warm, silted reservoirs. The rock riffles where insects hatched and fish spawned vanished under thick layers of mud, and the wall itself became a locked gate. Fish that had evolved to swim upstream to spawn simply could not pass it. The fish that had always defined the Baraboo began to disappear. The smallmouth bass, which needs clean, moving water over gravel to thrive, gave way to the species that can stand a stagnant pond: carp, bullhead, sucker. By the late 20th century, a fishery survey on one stretch of the river found only 13 species above the dam, and the single most common fish in the water was carp. That carp was a warning sign almost nobody read. The Baraboo was not technically dead, but it was decaying by inches, slowly enough that no one noticed, because almost no one alive could remember it any other way. Now, picture as many as 11 of those gates strung along a single river, one after another. At that point, you no longer have a river. You have a chain of disconnected ponds wearing a river's name. If you are the kind of person who wants to see what happens when a place everyone had written off gets a second chance, subscribe and stay with this channel. Every week we follow America's wildest recoveries, the rivers and the animals and the landscapes that came roaring back after the whole country had already given up on them. What happened next on the Baraboo is exactly that kind of story, and the silt was not even the most dangerous thing those dams were holding back. Buried in the riverbed behind two of them sat something far worse than mud. A coal gasification plant in the late 1800s had dumped contaminated sediment, coal tar into the channel, and the dams had been quietly trapping that poison in place for generations, sealed under still water like a secret nobody wanted to disturb. The irony at the heart of the story is a cruel one. The same dams that had built Baraboo, that had powered its mills and grown its streets, were the very things slowly strangling the river that gave the town its name. By the 1990s, the mills were long gone, and most of the dams were not producing anything anymore. They were producing stagnation, silt, and rising liability, and nothing else. One man's idea. The person who finally said it out loud was a canoeist named John Exo. Paddling the Baraboo Rapids one afternoon, Exo floated an idea that struck most of his neighbors as close to insane. Tear the dams out. Let the river run. The reaction was not gratitude. It was alarm. People sincerely believed that without the dams, the water itself would drain away and leave them with a muddy trench. Exo remembered it plainly years later. People genuinely thought the river would disappear, he recalled, and you could not even laugh at them because they were truly scared. You would think that in a town built on a river, someone would have known better. For a long time, nobody did. At first, the choice in front of the city looked small and local. Fix an aging dam or take it out. It did not feel like the kind of decision that would echo across an entire country. It was exactly that kind of decision, and the numbers made the case almost on their own. Repairing the old structure was going to cost the city somewhere between $694,000 and $1 million. Removing it would cost about $214,000. Take the dam out, in other words, and the river would heal for roughly a fifth of the price of keeping it sick. As a rule, tearing a dam down runs about a third of what it takes to rebuild one. City officials ran the math and chose removal. But the detail almost everyone missed at the time was that this was never going to be a single dam. It was going to be a chain reaction. A true coalition. And here is what outsiders never quite understand. None of it moved fast, and none of it moved by accident. It had taken many partners many years just to convince the community, raise the money, and plan the work. River advocates, the State Department of Natural Resources, local groups like the Friends of the Baraboo River, and conservation partners, including the Sand County Foundation, all lined up behind the effort, with backing from the Bradley Fund for the Environment and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The River Alliance of Wisconsin, which had become a statewide leader in dam removal, even helped write a citizen's guide to restoring rivers alongside the conservation group Trout Unlimited. Baraboo's own mayor came around and backed the plan. Because removing an old low dam is never really about the concrete. It tends to be one of the most heated arguments a small town can have, with passionate people on both sides. One state dam specialist described the resistance with surprising tenderness, comparing dam removal to the grieving process, because for a lot of people that flat, familiar water was part of who they were and where they came from. The water stayed. Then, in December of 1997, the grieving had to make room for a backhoe. Crews mounted a jackhammer on the machine and began breaking apart the waterworks dam. By the following April, the structure was gone, 9 feet high and 220 feet long, demolished and hauled away piece by piece. And the water did not disappear. The river did not drain into the mud. Instead, as the impoundment dropped, something nobody under the age of 70 had ever seen began to surface. The old rocky channel, the riffles, the Baraboo's original bones, rising back out of the silt exactly where they had always been, waiting. That was only the start. With the waterworks gone and the river plainly refusing to die, the partnership kept going. The Laval Dam came out in stages across 2000 and 2001, but before the last dams could fall, crews had to deal with that buried tar. They carefully removed the contaminated sediment from behind the Oak Street and Linen Mill dams, so that knocking down the walls would not send century-old poison surging downstream. Then, on October 10, 2001, crews pulled the last one, the Linen Mill Dam on the edge of Baraboo. When workers carried those final timbers away that October, The river ran free along its full main stem for the first time in over a century, and the linen mill removal alone uncovered miles of rock riffles that had been smothered under warm, slow water for decades. The nets tell it. By the spring after the first dam fell, biologists were already standing in the current with their nets, and what they pulled out rewrote the entire conversation. The change came almost too fast to track. Fish do not wait for ribbon cuttings. Within days of the water dropping and the current returning, they were already pushing into stretches that had been off limits for generations, nosing up the fresh riffles toward gravel their kind had not spawned on in a century and a half. Remember that survey that found only 13 species above the dam, dominated by carp? 6 months after the dam came out, the crews ran it again. This time, they counted 26 species. The number had doubled in half a year, and the most common fish in the water was no longer carp. It was smallmouth bass, the very fish the river had lost, climbing straight up the new rocky riffle that had replaced the dam and reclaiming water their kind had not touched in 150 years. People had assumed the recovery would take a generation, if it came at all. They were wrong, and the speed only grew more staggering as the data piled up. 18 months after the waterworks dam was removed, state biologists counted 24 species in a stretch that had been a near-dead pond. One small fish, the emerald shiner, recolonized 16 sites upstream and turned up roughly 76 miles above the old dam within a single year. Across the former impoundments, scientists scored the health of the river on a scale from 0 to 100, a measure of how intact an ecosystem really is, and at 3 of the 4 sites, those scores jumped by 35 to 50 points. What the engineers had built in place of each dam was not another wall, but a rocky riffle, a tumbling run of current and gravel that fish could swim straight up. The river had its old highway back. By the time researchers totaled it up, the removals had tripled the number of fish species in the Baraboo, and within about 5 years, the ecosystem had largely shaken off 150 years of being stifled. The ancient giant. Then came the fish that truly proved the river had its old strength back. The lake sturgeon. This is an ancient, slow-growing giant, a fish that does not return to broken, dirty water. In 2010, crews stocked more than 6,000 young sturgeon into the Baraboo. 2 years later, they added nearly 500 more, tagged so their movements could be tracked. Raised from wild parents at a state hatchery, in the slow, patient rebuilding of a population the dams had erased. Today, every so often, someone reports a sturgeon spawning in the shallows of a river that within living memory could barely hold a base. Walleye, sauger, channel catfish, and freshwater drum now run up into the upper river every spring to spawn, swimming through water that had been sealed off for a century and a half. A national record. But this was never really just about Baraboo. When that last dam came out, the Baraboo became the longest stretch of main stem river ever restored by dam removal in the United States. More than 100 miles of unbroken, free-flowing water cutting through the middle of a state that had spent generations damming everything it could reach. And Baraboo was not an isolated act. Wisconsin has now removed more dams than any other state in the country, well over 150 of them since 1960. The little river that everyone swore would die became the proof of concept for a national movement. A quarter of a century on, it still holds the record as the longest free-flowing stretch of reclaimed river in the country, and communities elsewhere now study it whenever they weigh whether to pull a dam of their own. Across the United States, the dams thrown up in the 1800s and 1900s are aging out, many of them useless, plenty of them quietly dangerous. The Baraboo showed the whole country something it needed to see. Taking one down does not have to be a loss. It can be the fastest way to bring a dead stretch of water roaring back. The fears that faded. The fears, meanwhile, never came true. The water did not vanish. And the property values that locals worried would collapse when the still ponds drained did not collapse either. A study rooted in this very part of Wisconsin found the opposite, that living beside a free-flowing river with its banks properly tended pushed long-term property values up rather than down. The renewal went beyond the channel itself. More than 500 landowners, many of them farmers, took part in a watershed program, changing how they worked the land to cut the pollution running into the river. None of this means tearing out a dam is free of consequences, and the honest scientists never pretended it was. Emily Stanley, a river ecologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, has pointed out that when a dam comes down, it does not only release fish and canoes, it can also release the nutrients and sediment that had been piling up behind the wall for decades, sending them rushing downstream all at once. Restoring a river is not a switch you flip and walk away from. It is a trade. And on the Baraboo, the people who studied it most carefully decided again and again that a living river was worth far more than a still one. Running again, the Baraboo that the mills had turned into a working machine became something else entirely. It is now the premier smallmouth bass river in the region, a magnet for paddlers and anglers, and the communities along its banks want to make it an official national water trail, 120 miles of free-flowing, fully accessible river. In 2021, they gathered to mark 20 years since the final dam came down, with a documentary film revisiting the people who fought for it. Running quietly underneath all of it is an older truth, spoken by a traditional chief of the Ho-Chunk Nation, whose people ran these waters long before any mill wheel turned. All of this land, he said, used to be theirs at one time. The river the settlers stopped is moving again, the way it moved for the people who knew it first. Which brings the story back to John Exo, the canoeist whose idea once made an entire town afraid. Years after the dams came down, he could lower his canoe into the Baraboo and paddle straight through the rapids that had spent a century and a half drowned under flat, dead water. The man who was warned the river would disappear got to glide through it instead, alive and loud and running, exactly where everyone had sworn it would die. The fish, which know nothing of governors or ceremonies, had already responded long before him. They did not ask permission, and they did not need a generation. Given a clear path and clean rock to spawn on, a river that had been silenced for a century and a half started coming back in a matter of months. If a story like this stays with you, subscribe and stay with us, because we keep finding the wild places that refuse to stay dead. And here's the question I want you to sit with. If a dam near your town came down tomorrow and the river returned, do you think the people there would fight to save the wall or cheer to watch it fall? Tell me in the comments.